Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the National Board of Forensic Evaluators webinar entitled Introduction to Forensic Mental Health. My name is Aaron Norton, and I am going to be our presenter today. I'm the Executive Director of Mbfe. An introduction about who I am and what I do, and also a disclosure. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm a certified forensic mental health evaluator by the National Board of Forensic Evaluators. And I work in a private practice where I do both psychotherapy and clinical and forensic evaluations. And I also do clinical supervision in my practice and do some adjunct work for the University of South Florida. And I'm president of the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association, the Southern Regional Director for the American Mental Health Counselors Association. And I do have a disclosure, which is that later on in these slides, eventually we'll get to some options that you have for certification or credentialing in forensic work. And when we do that, of course, one of the organizations I'll be talking about is the National Board of Forensic Evaluators. And since I am the executive director of that organization, I, of course, get a paycheck from them. So when I go over some of those options for credentialing, understand that Mbfe, when I talk about our certification process, I obviously have a financial investment in the organization. But I guess another important thing to disclose would be why I do, because I started off just as a guy who was doing forensic evaluations and was trained by my supervisor to do them. And then I saw that the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association was doing a workshop with the National Board of Forensic Evaluators. And I saw they were endorsed by the American Mental Health Counselors Association. And I said, I really ought to take that training to make sure that I know what I'm doing. And I took it, and I was amazed at some of the stuff I found out that I was doing wrong. And I really enjoyed the process. It was very helpful. I got certified, and then I got involved as a volunteer for Mbfe. And most of the time that I've done stuff with Mbfe, I was a volunteer, because I believe very much in the work that they do. So I do get paid now, but it's because it's an organization I believe an awful lot in, and you'll see that later on. This actually brings us to some polling questions so that I can get a sense of who's out there today. We're stabilizing here, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and call it. Most of you, about 60% identify as counselors, close to it anyway. But we also have some social workers and psychologists and students on today's webinar, so welcome everybody. And with that having been said, I think we'll go on to a second polling question, which is, I'd love for you to describe your level of forensic experience to date. It's like we have a pretty good number of you who either have a moderate amount of experience or quite a bit of experience. Several folks who are new to this area of specialization as well. About 44% of you are pretty new to forensic evaluation, it looks like. So hopefully we'll have a little something for everybody, because I'm going to cover some fundamentals and some basics. But it's interesting how many people work in forensic evaluation that sometimes haven't been exposed to some of that information. And hopefully it'll also be a good review for some of you and a great introduction for those of you who don't have any experience in the field yet. So, and let's get back to our slides. What are we going to cover today? We are going to define forensic mental health evaluation, which sometimes surprisingly can be a little bit elusive actually. And then we're going to identify some differences between forensic and clinical evaluation. We'll learn about the role of an expert versus a fact witness. We will give a good description of various types of forensic mental health evaluations, because a lot of people are surprised how many areas of forensic evaluation there really are in this area of specialization. And then we're going to clarify the issue of counselors and psychological tests, because it looks like about 60% of you are counselors. So you'll probably find that helpful information. And also those of you who are MFTs and CSWs, you'll probably also find that section helpful as well. And then we'll explore some of the ethical considerations for this unique area of specialization. You'll learn about what the Daubert rule is. We'll also talk about the Frye standard, but they're two different standards that are used in different jurisdictions throughout the US in terms of what's considered good expert testimony and what's not. We'll discuss how you can establish yourself as a forensic expert and then some resources to learn more about this area of specialization. So hopefully this is what you were looking for, because this is what we're covering today. If there's something else though that you're wanting to make sure that we get to that you don't see on this list, you can go ahead and enter that information into the chat box, which is also where you can ask questions that you'd like to have answered throughout the webinar. And at various points, I'm going to check in, take a look at that chat box, see if we have some questions to address. All right. So before we go any further, I think on that note, I'm actually going to look at the chat box, see if we have anything that I need to pay attention to. Nope, looks like we are good so far. Great. So we're going to favor, one thing I like about the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics is they do provide an actual glossary with definitions in the back of their Code of Ethics. And they actually define the term forensic evaluation. They define it as the process of forming opinions for courts ratings based on professional knowledge or expertise and supported by appropriate data. This is already a lot of information in a way, because the forensic evaluation is not the report that you type up and send in. That's just one part of the evaluation. The evaluation is the entire process involving that case from start to finish. Every point of contact, your clinical interview, any testing that you do, any background information you review. The entire process is the forensic evaluation. So this can get to be an important definition when we start to look at some of the ethical considerations for forensic evaluation later on, and hopefully that will make more sense when we get to some future slides here. So what we have found is most mental health professionals who we do some training with about forensic evaluation were initially trained not to do forensic evaluations, but to do clinical evaluations in the context of providing psychotherapy or treatment, maybe for individuals with a broad range of either mental disorders or at least presenting concerns that a mental health professional might help out with. Some went to grad school and they were literally just learning how to do forensic evaluations, but that's not the vast majority of mental health professionals out there. And in fact, most people who do forensic evaluations, it seems, started off doing therapy. And many of them, myself included, still do therapy as well as forensic evaluation. So because of that, it's kind of an interesting transition to go from that therapeutic or clinical focus to a more forensic focus. And it's an important one. Typically, a forensic evaluation is going to have a pretty narrow focus on some kind of a psycholegal question of some kind. An example might be, is this individual competent to waive her rights to an attorney? That's a very different question than the question we're trying to answer for most people who come to us for help in a therapeutic environment. Because in that environment, we're trying to figure out, what all is this person concerned with? What are the various problems that they would like to address? What are their goals? And also, even aside from those initial goals that they bring up, on a holistic perspective, what's going on in their lives and what could be additional problems that we need to know about that either could be a part of formulating our diagnosis, or they could end up being things that we address in a treatment plan, or that we refer the client out to, or maybe defer. Maybe we say, we're not going to work on that goal at all right now, but at least we know that it's an issue. So it's a very broad focus in your therapeutic evaluation, but it's usually not the case for a forensic evaluation. There are exceptions that we'll go through, we'll talk about later on, but usually you're being asked a small number very specific questions with a relatively narrow focus in that sense. The client, what the client tells you, their perception of what's going on, is emphasized in therapeutic or clinical work. Because you're really most interested in reality as the client sees it most of the time in therapeutic work. You're going to meet the client where they're at. You're going to work with where they're at right now. But in forensic work, the client's perspective, what they tell you that they think is going on, is really just one data point in an entire set of data. And in fact, it's really a data point that sometimes it's pretty questionable whether that data is very accurate. And I do think generally the client's perspective is the single most important data point in forensic evaluation, but that's not always the case. A client can be compelled to participate in a forensic evaluation. It's less likely the case when a client comes in for therapeutic or clinical work. And again, there are exceptions. Those of you who, like me, maybe started your career off working in substance use treatment, you know that's not true in that environment. And that therapeutic environment, most of your clients in most settings were coerced or compelled in some way to participate in treatment. But in most general therapeutic settings, clients are coming to you because they want to work on something. And that's a very different context than forensic work. The client's autonomy, their choices about the direction that they want to take, that's going to be de-emphasized in forensic work, but emphasized in clinical work, because in forensic work, you're there to answer certain questions. You're not there to do what the client wants you to do. And there are strong threats to validity sometimes in forensic work, which we'll cover in a future slide, because you might have a client who is incentivized to skew information in one direction or another in forensic work. Sometimes it happens in clinical work also. It just doesn't happen as often in comparison. And in the forensic arena, your role is evaluative. You are an examiner. You're not a therapist. You're not an advocate trying to help somebody. You're there to provide an independent and objective evaluation and answer the questions posed to you. And you may have less control over pace and setting in the forensic arena. The most recent forensic evaluation I did, well, maybe not the most recent, but one of the most recent ones. I started the evaluation off the first two interviews were in my office, where I have a great degree of control over pace and setting. But then the client got taken into custody. And so the next two interviews were conducted in the jail, and each time in a different place. And I had no idea where that place would be until I got there. The first time it was in a room with brick walls and no windows and a table. And the second time it was in a room with all glass walls with a crowd of inmates standing around outside of those glass walls. That would have been a tough place to do testing for some scenarios. It's a good thing I had already done all my testing by then, but just an illustration of not having as much control over pace and setting in the forensic arena. So, by the way, why do I do forensic evaluation? What really drew me to it? If you look in that handouts folder, which again, we'll be posting that link in the chat box later on. That folder will contain an article that I wrote that was published in the Advocate magazine, the magazine of the American Mental Health Counselors Association. And I kind of laid out a few reasons why I think it's great for some therapists to consider specializing in forensic evaluation, training in that area, and doing work in that area. First thing is, it's necessary. It's an important service. It has a significant impact for the public and for society. It is impactful. The work that you do in this arena has the potential to make a big difference in some way or another. And I think that for America's legal system to work optimally, you have to have very good quality, objective evaluations. You just have to. And it's meaningful work in that sense. It's in demand. There are only so many people who specialize in this work. Most mental health professionals do not. And you might be in a jurisdiction where there's plenty of evaluators, but many people live in jurisdictions where there's not, where there's a shortage of them. And there are many states throughout the country that have been sued for due process violations because clients are spending too much time being incarcerated without having access, without being able to move forward with their case because there's a shortage of qualified evaluators and a big backlog time for getting those evaluations completed and into the court system. And it's economic recession resistant because the criminal justice system, as well as the civil courts, they don't stop operating just because we're in a time of recession. They continue to operate. And so it's always a necessary service. Even during a pandemic, it is a necessary service. It's challenging. So it's an opportunity to really grow and expand your skill set. And it can also be very lucrative because it does tend to be much higher paying than standard therapy. So let's get into the role of an expert versus a fact witness. Which brings us to a polling question. A therapist agrees to testify in court regarding her client's progress with therapy in connection to a violation of probation hearing. This therapist should testify as A, a fact witness, or B, an expert witness. Give you a moment to decide. And again, if you haven't signed up for the text message polling yet, just send a text with the words Aaron Norton 175 in the body of the text message to the number 37607, and that will get you set up. All right, well, it looks like most of you have responded so far. A majority are saying a fact witness, but about a quarter of you are saying an expert witness. And this is an interesting group because most of the time I get a pretty even split between the two answers, or sometimes I actually get a majority saying that the answer is B. So let's find out. A fact witness reports on the facts. They don't offer opinions. At least they're really not supposed to offer opinions. They focus on the facts of the therapy. And the expert witness, in contrast, will actually be providing some kind of an opinion. The expert witness will be rendering an opinion to the court based on the data that he or she collected. If you are a therapist for a client, so you're providing that client with care, you're treating that client, and if, by the way, you examine, for example, the 2020 Task Force's definition of the counseling profession, they define counseling as a professional relationship that empowers diverse individuals, groups, families, etc., to accomplish their goals. Those goals could be career goals, mental health goals, wellness-related goals, relationship goals. But by definition, the therapist is there to help the client accomplish things. But an expert witness who's being hired as a forensic evaluator or appointed as a forensic evaluator, they're not there to help somebody. They're there to formulate an opinion based on the data collected. So that means if you're a therapist, you're automatically presumed to be biased by the very nature of your relationship with the client. So when you go to court, you're really supposed to stick with the facts. And that might sound strange because so many people tell me, but Aaron, when I've had to go to court for a client, for a therapy client, I've been asked what my opinion is. There is a way that you do testify to your opinion. This is what it would look like. The first time I went into court as a fact witness, it was because I worked in a Department of Corrections program, a substance abuse treatment program, and our legal team was very good. So they, of course, coached me, you do not provide any opinions. You testify only to the facts of the case record. Nothing more, nothing less. Minimally answer the questions, sticking straight to the record and what's in it. So, judge turns to me at one point and says, so Aaron, what do you think? You think that if we let this guy stay in the drug treatment program, that he's not just going to abscond and relapse and end up right back in court? What was my answer to that question? Did I give him my opinion? What I said was, well, here's what I can tell you. What I can tell you is that I completed a treatment plan review on April 12th, 2003, whatever date it was. And on this treatment plan review, I documented that he was making satisfactory progress with all of his treatment goals, that he was maintaining abstinence as evidenced by 23 negative random urinalysis drug screens, and that my prognosis at the time was fair. Well, what did I do by saying that? I said, these are the fact is that in the record, you will see that I said these things. But I'm not going to tell you what I think is going to happen with this guy in the future, because that's an opinion that you don't see in this treatment record. And I'm not here to offer a new opinion, because I'm not a forensic evaluator in this case. I'm not a guy who got hired to answer a specific question about the probability of relapse for this individual in the future. So I can only tell you what's in my record. I can say this note on this date says this thing. That's a fact. And even if the thing that's in that record was my opinion as a therapist, the fact is I'm pointing out that that is in that document. That makes sense? I know it sounds like a strange delineation to some people, but it's a very important one. So let's move into the types of forensic evaluation then. First type, competency evaluations. These are evaluations that are very focused on the here and now. Question is, can this individual, are they competent to participate in this legal process? Sometimes it's a little bit more specific, like are they competent to plead guilty? Are they competent to waive their right to an attorney? But usually it's, are they competent to participate in this legal process or this trial in general? And it's not, were they competent 3 months ago when they allegedly did or didn't do this thing that they're here for. It's right now, are they competent to do this? And it's not enough to do something like a mental status exam, nowhere near enough. What you have to be able to determine, and I understand this will vary state to state because each state has its own unique laws, but generally all across the country, you're going to see things like this individual has to be able to appreciate and understand the nature of the charges raised against them. Do they know what they're charged with? And do they know what that means, what that allegation means? And if they don't know it, is it because no one ever told them? Or is it because they lack the capacity to know it? And if they lack the capacity to know it in the here and now, is it because of one or more organic mental disorders, typically excluding substance use disorders or the effects of a particular substance? And the second thing would be, can they participate actively in the legal process? Can they appropriately talk to their counsel? Can they communicate with their counsel in a way that will allow their attorney to do their job in advocating for them? If they chose to, could they take the stand? Could they testify relevantly regarding the case? Can they exhibit appropriate courtroom behavior? If a client gets into a courtroom and believing that they're about to be dragged to hell by a demonic entity, they run to the corner of a room and curl up in a fetal position, sobbing violently, then they're not going to be able to participate appropriately in the process, are they? So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at with competency evaluation. The second type of evaluation is a criminal responsibility evaluation, which in most states people know of as the insanity plea. This one is not as much here and now. It's really not here and now. It is going back in a magic time machine to a certain point in the past when something allegedly happened and trying to figure out at the time of that event what the person's mental state was. Could they appreciate and understand the nature of their actions and the legality of those actions and the implications for those actions, or the moral fortitude involved in the situation? And if they couldn't, was it because of one or more organic mental disorders, typically excluding antisocial personality disorder and typically excluding any behavior while under the influence of substances? Because in every jurisdiction I know of anyway, the law treats substance use as sort of like this. If you choose to take in an illicit substance, or even if it's not illicit, a psychoactive substance, then you assume in advance responsibility for all of your actions while you're under the influence of that substance. So if I did something when I was having when I was experiencing a hallucination and I was delusional because of my schizophrenia, that will be treated very differently than if I did something when I was hallucinating because I'd taken LSD. Now I do see we have a few maybe questions and comments in the chat box.
Hi, Aaron.
Yes.
Sorry to pause the webinar. It looks like we have a few people who are either not registered at all for this event and somehow got the link, or it looks like we have people in the webinar right now who are attending somehow but have not paid.
Okay. Well, I don't know how that happens necessarily, but what I would suggest is for those of you who are attending today and you're wanting to get CEs, it would be vital that you register, which you can do at mbfe.net. And Valentino, I assume that it's still an active registration link, even though it's after 3 o'clock. But maybe you could paste the link to the registration page in the chat box.
Okay, and for someone whose registration is not here, how would you like to?
You mean,
For
let's say
some,
that somebody's attending right now and they have not registered?
correct.
I would ask them to go register, and maybe you could send those people messages.
I did.
And then if they don't respond, then I suppose you could remove them from the webinar.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay,
Alrighty.
that will work. And I'm just going to switch something up here real quick because I just realized all this time, for some reason, the sound's coming through the wrong place for me. So let me just fix that real quick and do a little test. There we go. That's good. All right. Fixed. Alrighty, so, and I was getting to the chat box, getting to questions. So let me do that real quick here. Let's see what we have here. We have
a question from Delvon.
Okay. Based on your experience, which area of forensic mental evaluation do you find the most challenging or requires the most specialized to least specialized training? Okay, so I'll throw something out about that. First thing is, I really can't answer that question. And the reason I can't fully answer it is because I don't do most of the stuff on this screen. In fact, I think it's a bad idea to do most of the stuff on this screen. So I haven't had experience with most of these types of evaluations, nor have I had adequate training for a lot of them. And so I can't really speak from experience, but I can tell you about the things I do. I've gotten a lot of training on competency evaluations, but I don't actually do them, in part because in my jurisdiction, we'll actually get to that later on. And I've had some training in child custody evaluations, but I don't do them. And I don't do them in part because I don't work, and even in my therapy practice, I've never worked with anyone younger than an adolescent age, about 13 or 14, and older is what I work with. And I don't consider myself competent to treat children. Didn't have specialized training or experience in that area. And so by extension, I don't think it's appropriate for me to do child custody evaluations because I don't work with kids. I don't have that special skill set and knowledge base on child development, for example, that I think you'd need to have to do that kind of evaluation. I have done disability evaluations, and I've been involved in personal injury evals. Substance abuse evals is my biggest area of specialty, and downward departure is probably my second biggest area, which we'll define in a moment here. But all these other things I've never done myself. I will tell you that child custody evaluations are very complex because in a child custody evaluation, the evaluator isn't evaluating one person. They're typically evaluating any and all parents that are involved in the case, and any and all children that are involved in the case. And in addition to doing multiple individual evaluations, they're also interviewing a lot of people and collecting a lot of information, and it's quite time consuming and involved. And I think it requires somebody who not only has great interviewing skills and abilities and testing experience, but also somebody who has a good mastery of child development and human growth and development in general. And so I think that's an example of a kind of advanced area. And in fact, we'll talk more about specialized credentialing for people who do those kinds of evaluations. I guess for some of these, I can't really say that one requires more expertise than another. They just require different expertise. So for disability evaluations, if you don't know the world of disability, then you're not going to be doing those evaluations. It's not enough to know whether somebody has these different symptoms in the DSM and they have this disorder, but do you know about functional limitations that are imposed or that are posed by different disorders? Do you know about how somebody's symptoms affects their ability to perform substantial gainful employment? Do you know what substantial gainful employment is? And if you don't have that knowledge base in disability, then you shouldn't be doing that kind of evaluation. And if you're an expert in that area, could I say you're any more or less of an expert than a personal injury expert who knows the world of trauma really well, or and could I say that that person's any more or less a specialized expert than the person who knows the world of violent potential? And they have a good understanding of what would indicate a higher probability that somebody could become a serious threat to themselves or to the public if, for example, they were released on parole. So they're just different, and I don't know that I could say that one requires a higher level of expertise than another would. In guardianship, do you know whether a person has the capacity for self-care? Do you know what the activities of daily living are and how certain disorders could affect somebody's capacity to take care of themselves? And that's a different skill set than immigration evaluations. So that's my overly convoluted answer here. And it's kind of organically worked itself in well to me explaining the rest of these types of evaluations a bit. I'm looking, will there be slides emailed? Somebody's asked. So we did post a link to the slides in
we took
Zoom
care of
webinar.
that. We took
Okay,
care of that
great.
in the chat box, yes, and I sent that person a message.
All right, so it looks like that was the big question. So I'll continue describing these evaluations. Civil commitment, the question is somebody an imminent risk to self or others because of one or more organic mental disorders, again, usually typically excluding substance use disorders or being under the influence of a substance, and typically excluding antisocial personality disorder. And this would be a scenario where the question is, does somebody need to be hospitalized, perhaps against their will, in order to protect themselves and the public in the here and now, which has an overlap with potential for violence in some cases. Child abuse and neglect, again, I'm not going to do those evals because I am not an expert on childhood, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me. And I already talked about child custody evaluations. Now, I've noticed a lot of people love doing child custody evaluations because not only is it such important work, but it really is really delving deeply and going through an awful lot of information to construct a very thorough picture of what might be going on. And usually the question at hand is, what's in the child's best interest from this collected? Disability evaluations, I talked about a little bit already. There are at least 8 different scenarios where a forensic mental health evaluator could be involved in an immigration case. For example, what if you had somebody who is not here in the United States legally, and there's the possibility of them being deported, but that person is a caregiver for someone who is here legally, who relies and depends on their caregiving, and removing that person could place that American citizen or person who's here legally, could place that person in serious risk. Sometimes that involves mental disorders for which a mental health evaluator might be needed. What if somebody is claiming asylum? They're applying for asylum because they're saying that they were being persecuted in their country of origin by maybe a regime, for example. Maybe they were even taken into custody, maybe even tortured, and they developed PTSD. A forensic evaluator might be involved in a case like that. So there are a lot of different scenarios where you might see a forensic mental health evaluator being needed for an immigration case. And this is one specialty area that we see really expanding. There's a high demand for it right now, and there's a shortage of people who do it and do it well, for that matter. And even better, if you could be a forensic evaluator who was bilingual, who's truly fluent in another language, but you don't have to be to do these evaluations if there are appropriate interpreter services available. Personal injury cases might be, maybe I'm saying that I was your employee and you were negligent in some way with your company. You didn't do something that you should have done, that you had the responsibility to do. And because of that, I have now incurred some kind of harm, some kind of trauma. Maybe I'm saying I have PTSD because of your negligence, and I'm suing for the costs of my care and treatment and my lost productivity and livelihood because of that. So much of our criminal justice system is tied up in substance use in different ways. And so you may be doing evaluations that would determine things like, is this person a good candidate for drug court? Or might they be appropriate for this DOC substance abuse treatment program? Or this person, could what they did or didn't do, allegedly, be explained by the influence of substances that they were using at the time? I've even had to do these connected to child custody cases. They weren't child custody evals, they were substance abuse evals because the judge maybe said, I want you, parent A, to do an evaluation to determine if you have a problem with alcohol, and if so, what kind of treatment would be needed. So that's mostly what I do, substance abuse evals. We already talked about violent potential a little bit. We already talked about guardianship a little bit. Downward departure, in some states, it might be called maybe something like sentencing deviation. But this is a scenario where maybe it's usually a defense attorney that would be hiring you. And the situation is that an individual, maybe they're not contesting whether they did the thing that they're accused of doing. And they're also not saying that they were legally insane at the time, as you'd see in a criminal responsibility eval. But maybe they are saying that they have one or more mental disorders that need treatment and they haven't gotten that treatment. And that treatment's not been available to them. And if that treatment were provided, then, or maybe if it had been provided, maybe none of this would ever happen. And maybe if it were provided, that would be better for the public than to just incarcerate a person and then release them. So the scenario is usually somebody's trying to get treatment instead of incarceration. And in many places, there's just not adequate treatment in the correctional system. So they might be looking for a facility that the person can be treated at an inpatient or residential treatment for extended period of time, for example. It allows, many states have laws that allow the judge to deviate from minimum sentencing guidelines in some cases like this, where you would need a forensic evaluator to offer some of those opinions to the court. Now, I'm not saying that every forensic evaluation ever is captured on the screen. In fact, I could probably guarantee you that it's not. But these are some of the more common ones. And it's a great illustration because some people will look at this slide and they'll say, I'm in over my head because I don't know how to do these things. I've never heard of some of this stuff. But again, you aren't expected to know how to do all these things. I don't know how to do all these things. You would be expected to know the types of evaluations that you're doing very well. You might choose one or two or three areas that really line up very well with your clinical skills and expertise, and that you can really focus on in your forensic evaluation work. All right, before we go to the next slide, I see a couple new comments in the chat box, so let me just check it out and see. Okay, looks like it's more administrative stuff, so I think we're good to move on. Components of a quality evaluation. Now, I'm not saying this is the way it's going to look for every type of forensic eval, but I am saying this is what I would recommend that an evaluator use for their data sources whenever possible, and especially if needed, to really answer the questions posed to them by a legal entity. First, you have your clinical interview. That's the time that you spend communicating with that client that's being evaluated, doing a diagnostic interview, learning more about what's going on with the client or was going on with the client. And then you have your records reviews. This can include treatment records, not just mental health. You'd be amazed at the number of times I pull records from somebody's primary care physician or their orthopedist, and I find information that actually ended up being highly relevant to my evaluation. Tons of examples of that. Maybe they've done previous evaluations. Maybe they were forensic, maybe they weren't, maybe they were clinical. Arrest records, I read the police report. What were the officers who made the arrest? What did they document as their observations and as the facts leading up to that arrest? I do public records searches because I want to know, are there more maybe legal problems out there that they did not disclose to me when I asked them? And is that history relevant to the questions that are being posed by the court? And court records can also be very helpful. One of the recent evaluations I did, the court sent a psychologist in to screen for whether a competency eval was needed, and the psychologist submitted a report to the court saying, no, we don't need a competency eval because there's no reason to believe this person isn't competent to participate. So that was a document that was helpful for me in that downward departure evaluation. Then the third data source is collateral information. Oh, and I forgot to mention here, like the client I told you about who interviews 3 and 4 were done in jail. The jail records that I accessed were highly relevant, perhaps critical to the opinions that I rendered in that case. And some people forget, if you got a client that's in jail, that client might have medical records right there in the jail. They could give you some very helpful information that are very recent, very current. Collateral information can be interviews with spouses or partners. with family members, friends and neighbors, employers and coworkers, a 12-step sponsor maybe if that applies, and a substance abuse evaluation. These are other people whose self-report might help to substantiate or corroborate a client's self-report, or could perhaps contradict it. And no one thing by itself is sufficient to inform a conclusion. It's the combination of these variables. I love it when I collect all this information and the truth just naturally emerges. I say the truth loosely because I can never really know 100% whether something's true with these evaluations. But I can show whether something is highly likely given the evidence available a lot of times. And a lot of times all the data points just kind of point to the same seamless conclusion, and those are the best case scenarios, I think. And then finally, we have our objective test data. These are psychological tests, normed, valid, and reliable and reputable tests. Generally a bad idea to focus on more subjective tests, like projective tests like the Rorschach ink blot. Tests that have too much variation in how they can be interpreted. It seems like in the forensic arena, it's not just it seems like, you'll see it in the professional literature over and over again. The forensic arena seems to prefer quantifiable test data rather than qualitative test data, but qualitative information is extremely helpful too. So that brings us to what is probably a pretty important polling question, I think. Assuming that they've been properly trained, can licensed counselors, social workers, and marriage and family therapists administer and interpret psychological tests? You can say A, they can neither administer nor interpret those tests. You can say B, they can administer but not interpret them. You can say C, they can administer and interpret level A and B tests but not level C tests. Or you could say D, they can both administer and interpret all types of psychological tests. And so far, the majority of you are saying they can administer and interpret level A and B tests, but not level C tests. About a third of you are saying they can administer and interpret all types of psychological tests. And 17% are saying they can neither administer nor interpret psychological tests. All right, so to answer this question, I am going to actually show you a resource that we have at the Mbfe website, because it's important to me that you know how to access this information for yourself after today's webinar. So I'm going to go to nbfe.net for National Board of Forensic Evaluators. And when you get to that site, you'll see resources, and then you'll see fair access to tests. When you get to that site, you'll see that we've amassed a great deal of information, various documents from various states and test manufacturers and associations. But I mostly want to draw your attention to our analysis and position paper. And while this paper is focused on counselors, much of it applies to social workers and marriage and family therapists as well. And it's good for you who are psychologists to know about this also, because quite literally, we've had some psychologists tell courts things that aren't true about this topic. And that could have an impact on your reputation in the court system. Now, our position at Mbfe is that any licensed mental health professional who has appropriate training to do so should be able to administer and interpret psychological tests. This is consistent with the position of the National Fair Access Coalition on testing. And we base this on several facts. One is counselors have always been experts in testing. The irony is, at the turn of the 20th century, the first professional counselors were testers. They were psychometricians. In many textbooks, you'll see they gained their stronghold in the social sciences because of their heavy reliance on psychometrics. They were testers during World War I and World War II. They were testers for the government for quite some time. So it's always been a part of the counseling profession. But second, it's within the scope of practice of counselors. As defined by CACREP, all CACREP accredited programs in clinical mental health counseling require all students to have been trained on appropriate administration and interpretation of psychological tests. In my grad program, which was a clinical mental health counseling program, I learned to administer and interpret the MMPI and many other tests while I was a graduate student. Also, according to the National Board for Certified Counselors, we need to know how to administer and interpret these tests. According to the American Counseling Association, the American Mental Health Counselors Association, the Association for Assessment and Research in Counseling, and the 2020 Task Force, the collective wisdom of 31 major counseling organizations all agree that it's part of our scope of practice as counselors. And the Social Security Administration has clarified that they will accept test data and evaluations offered by licensed counselors and social workers and for disability cases. And the third point is that counselors, by and large, meet the standards of test manufacturers for level C certification, whether it's PAR or it's Pearson or it's MHS assessments or it's Western Psychological Services or WPS. And you can read all of this information later if you'd like to. Lastly, it kind of doesn't make logical sense, could be even detrimental to the public, to say that the majority of mental health professionals are expected to diagnose and treat something under their scope of practice for which they cannot even test. Where is the logic there? I can't test to see if this thing is true, but I'm supposed to diagnose and treat it on the other hand. And finally, most state licensure boards agree with this because there's a question of what should be and then what actually is. There are some states, though, that do limit the ability of counselors and other mental health professionals who aren't psychologists to administer and interpret tests. There aren't very many of them, but Alabama, Arkansas, and Texas will allow counselors to administer and interpret all tests except projective tests. And if you heard me talk about that earlier, you know that's probably not a problem if you're in the forensic arena because you probably aren't doing many projective tests. You're probably doing quantitative tests. So not an issue in those states for forensic work. California, though, has a very interesting and complicated verbiage in their statute. Counselors can administer and interpret tests except projective tests, individually administered IQ tests, neuropsych tests, or batteries of 3 or more tests to detect psychosis and criminal behavior. Very interesting statute there. Louisiana, unfortunately, is one of the worst. They're a state that only allows counselors to administer symptom screening checklists. So you wouldn't be able to do something like the MMPI or the PAI in Louisiana. But you could probably do the brief symptom inventory or the symptom checklist 90 revised or a Beck depression inventory. But those tools are limited in some ways in their efficacy or their usefulness in the forensic arena. But you could still probably do some forensic evals in Louisiana. And then the worst is Tennessee, where you just can't do testing there if you're a counselor. But those are the only states for which we know of an exception. And I have reviewed the scope of practice in every state in the country. And for years, we've been collecting information from all over the country. So it's possible that there could be some other obscure rule or something in some state that we don't know about, but unlikely. And if you know of another exception, please by all means send it to us because it's important to us that people know. And really, ultimately, it's your responsibility to know what the law is in your state and what your scope of practice is in your state. We can't know everything all the time in every state, but we try our best. And then the last, that's really it for that paper. And you'll see that for some states, we even have documentation, like here in Florida, we have documentation both from the board that manages counseling licenses and from the board that manages psychology licenses, saying that, yeah, it's appropriate for counselors with appropriate training to administer and interpret tests. They even give examples like the MMPI, the Wexler, and even the Halstead-Rayton, which is a neuropsychological test. Because in Florida, as in most states, the issue isn't what type of mental health professional you are. It is on an individual level, are you competent? Are you appropriately trained to administer and interpret this particular test? So, having said that,
We do have a couple questions in the box.
okay, let's see what we have with these questions. Question about the last slide. You mentioned a clinical interview. One of the tools I use for structured interviews during clinical mental health evaluations is the SCID-5CV, Structured Clinical Interview for DSM-5 Disorders. Generally, do you perform structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interviews? Thanks for talking to me on this, or taking time on this matter. Okay, that's a great question. So I do, in most of my evaluations, I use a structured or at least semi-structured interview tool. Like I tend to use the Mini International Neuropsychiatric Interview, except I find it way overly wordy and verbose for the average client. So my verbiage is slightly different than what you're going to see in the actual tool itself. But yeah, I tend to use structured interviews, but not always. It may not, hypothetically, it might not be necessary or even relevant to a particular case in some scenarios, but usually I do. And then a second question, I don't know what happened to my chat box. Let me see if I can pull it back here. That's not good. Okay, there we go. Chat box is back. So let's see what the second question was. Does that mean yes or no for LCSW? Okay, so in Florida, what I was just talking about for Florida, the answer is yes. LCSWs can administer and interpret psychological tests as long as they have appropriate training and expertise to do so. And my experience has been that it's that way in most other states also. But I'm a little bit less familiar with the exceptions, any states that are exceptions for social workers. Every state I have examined has the same position though. I have examined Georgia and Utah, Washington, and West Virginia, and several other states. But I'm not as knowledgeable about, for social workers, what states might be exceptions. So also, I think that was from Tanoa. So if you would like, you could put what state you're interested in the chat box, and I can see if I already know the answer. And if I don't, which is likely, then maybe someone else that's attending today might be able to chime in the chat box and let us know. Looks like New Jersey. I do not know the answer to whether an LCSW in New Jersey can administer and interpret psychological tests if they have appropriate training and competence. So maybe somebody else does. What I usually do to find out, one of the things I do is I go to their board and then I use their board's website to find their scope of practice, and I see if the scope of practice specifically says whether they can administer and interpret tests, and if so, what might be some exceptions. So, and if I can't find out from that, then I'll often reach out to the association in that state and certainly ask colleagues. I'll show you a tool that you can use to find out from colleagues later on in the webinar. Okay, so that's it for questions for now, it looks like. Let's get back to the slides then. So just because you can doesn't mean that you should administer and interpret tests, though. There are a lot of ethical considerations. One is you got to have competency as evidenced by your training, your education, and your supervised experience. So we'll talk about what happens if you don't have that and you want to do testing. But of course, there are a lot of other ethical considerations for testing. Choosing the right assessment methods, being able to justify why you are using a particular test for a particular case. You should be able to answer that question effectively in court if you're using that test in an evaluation. You avoid the outdated and obsolete measures. Now there's an exception in here. Sometimes you'll have a test that's well researched, and then a new version will come out that's not well researched yet, and you might decide to hold off on using the new version until there's adequate evidence available to show that it's just as reliable and valid, or more so as the previous version. But generally, you want to use the most updated test and provide an appropriate testing environment, and you document exceptions to that. You want to use multiple sources of data to supplement the test. You don't just draw a conclusion based on a test. That's not a good idea. And you want to consider multicultural factors, and that's a big one. Because if you're giving somebody a written test in the English language that requires a 5th grade reading level, but English is their second language and they don't have a 5th grade English reading level, then you got a problem, or at least a possible problem. At least it's a flaw, a chink in the armor, if opposing counsel gets pretty thorough and inventive. So you really have to look out for whether a test is really appropriate. And if you're not sure, but it's the best you got, then you should document that and take that into consideration. So I mentioned what happens if you don't have that, because if you go back far enough in time, maybe, for example, like I graduated from a core accredited program because I was dually trained as a rehabilitation counselor specializing in disability and as a clinical mental health counselor. One of those unique degree programs in the US that are dual major in that sense. And I was taught all kinds of stuff on testing. But I wasn't from a K-CREP accredited program. I was from a core accredited program. What if I'd come from a K-CREP accredited or non-K-CREP accredited program that didn't require a testing course? Now here in Florida, all licensed counselors have to have training in individual evaluation and assessment, which typically will include testing, but maybe not. Maybe you didn't get that graduate level coursework. Maybe you did, but you don't remember anything about it, and you have no experience with testing, and you're fuzzy and you're rusty in your testing skills, or you don't know the right kinds of tests. You haven't had experience with them. Then get additional training, and you can do that in lots of ways. You can go to the test manufacturers' websites. Usually offer some free introduction courses, and then maybe there are some courses you pay for to get more advanced training on that test. Maybe you hire a consultant, somebody who's an expert in a particular type of testing, and use them as a resource as you learn proficiency with testing. Maybe you take a CE course like this one. We offer at National Board of Forensic Evaluators a 40-hour course on how to administer and interpret a wide range of tests. And it's kind of unique because the way this works, it's on-demand webinar lectures that you watch, but then you get an assignment where you have to actually administer or interpret a test, and you submit that, and it gets reviewed by the instructors and critiqued. And if you scored it inaccurately, or you did something inaccurate, then it gets kicked back to you and, hey, you know, the DEF scale and the FVA scale and the COR scales were scored incorrectly, and decision rule number 5 was wrong. And here's a resource that might help you to get those right. And if you can't do it second time around, they might say, hey, would you like to schedule a webcam session and we'll go over it together. I'll show you maybe what you're doing wrong. Because we don't want you to move on to the next module until you feel totally comfortable and confident that you know how to do it right. And you move through all 4 phases that way until you graduate. And upon graduation from that certificate or from that workshop, you're guaranteed level C testing administration with PAR, psychological assessment resources, one of those 4 major psychological test distributors in the US. And it is a course that's kind of costly. It's $1,500, but one forensic evaluation pays it off. And there's also a way to get a $500 discount on it if you are already pursuing the CFMHE credential, or then you get that $500 discount. So make sure you let us know if you're in that boat and you want to take it for less. But you could also go to other organizations and get appropriate testing, like Global Institute of Forensic Research and Counseling, GIFRC. They have some great courses on how to administer and interpret some violent potential tests. They're kind of pricey a lot of times, but they're good. In forensic evaluation, and there's a small subset of you that are going to appreciate this slide, and you know who you are. You're Star Trek fans. But in forensic eval, reason prevails. So you are expected to think like a Vulcan and not like a Klingon or a Romulan. In the Star Trek series, the Star Trek universe, Vulcans are very focused on logic and reason. They have worked hard to even suppress emotions, or at least be aware of or mindful of those emotions of them. The data leads them. But Klingons and Romulans are passionate, and there's a place for passion in our field, but less so in the forensic arena. Too much passion in the forensic arena can actually get you in trouble. There are threats to validity that really require a lot of objectivity in the forensic arena. Some of these phrases, positive impression management, means that a client is sort of exaggerating how good they are, so to speak. I see this a lot in any evaluation connected to a child custody case. They will answer questions like they are the first person to walk on water. And negative impression management is the opposite. I'm trying to make myself look worse than the actual clinical picture would warrant. You might see that, for example, in a disability evaluation sometimes, or a personal injury case, where there's a strong incentive for the client to exaggerate maybe how bad things are. And there are neurocognitive impairments sometimes in the picture that make it difficult for people to be accurate in their self-report. And there's also lack of insight in many cases. Clients who just kind of don't know what they don't know. And there are other threats to validity also, but these are some of them. And that brings us to a polling question. Polling question is, according to the ACA Code of Ethics 2014, when can a forensic evaluator evaluate a former client? Your options are A, never. B, if there are no other qualified evaluators within a reasonable distance of the client. C, if the client has been notified of the possible benefits and drawbacks and has made an informed choice to go with you anyway. D, if the judge orders a clinician to provide the evaluation. Or E, all but A are correct. Now, key word here, a former client. So just to clarify, this is not, the evaluator is not dealing with somebody who they are currently seeing as a therapy client, but maybe who they did in the past. Maybe it was years ago. All right, looks like about half of you are saying all but A are correct, that B, C, and D are all true. And 40% are saying C, if it's the client's informed choice, and 10% of you are saying it's never appropriate. Okay, so let's see what the answer is. The ACA Code of Ethics, as you will see, slide or bullet point number 2. Counselors do not evaluate current or former clients, clients' romantic partners, or clients' family members for forensic purposes. Counselors do not counsel individuals they are evaluating. They don't say avoid it. They don't say generally you don't. They don't say try not to. They just say do not. And that's pretty strong verbiage. Now you can say, well, Aaron, the answer should be that B, C, and D were all accurate. But literally the Code of Ethics, the answer would be A, never, which 10% of you said you thought was the right answer. Now, that's the ACA. That's their Code of Ethics. But there are other codes of ethics too. Take the AMCA Code of Ethics, which was just recently revised, the American Mental Health Counselors Association. Well, in 2015, AMCA said the same thing as ACA, do not do it, period. But their 2020 code uses slightly more tentative verbiage. They say, do not typically evaluate former clients. Now, a theme, a trend that you will see that makes the AMCA 2020 Code of Ethics different than the 2015 version is that they made several things that they worded as being ironclad. They softened the verbiage just slightly, to allow for that odd and unusual exception. Because who knows? Maybe there's some magical island somewhere where there's only one mental health professional who did therapy with somebody 20 years ago, and they're the only forensic evaluator, and the nearest island is 1,000 miles away, and there's no such thing as telehealth because there's no internet on this island, and etc. And I mean, maybe there's some oddball scenario out there, but I would just tell you avoid it at all costs if you can. And I've always been able to avoid it. And it's been no problem avoiding it. It's a good way to get disqualified as a witness because the other counsel can say, you're biased because your job was to help this person in the past. You built a therapeutic alliance and a relationship with them. And now you're going to be their independent, objective evaluator who's supposed to not be helping them at all and is supposed to be advocating for a truthful, objective answer to a psycholegal question. No, thank you. Why didn't? And on the stand, the opposing counsel can say, you know, Mr. Norton, can you read page 4 of the ACA Code of Ethics? That point right there at E13B, what does it say? And then I read it quietly, and then they can say, I'm sorry, could you say that louder so that everyone in the court can hear? And it's just not your defense. It's going to be tough, maybe, if this gets pointed out. So I understand it happens sometimes. People do it. I'm just saying I would avoid it at all costs. Of course, all of the codes say you're trying to be objective. You should solicit informed consent. So part of my process for forensic evaluation is, although I am a licensed mental health counselor and a licensed marriage or family therapist, I'm not your counselor or your therapist. I'm not here to help you, to provide you with therapy or help you solve problems or accomplish goals that you have. Instead, I'm here as an independent evaluator who has been requested by the court to provide an objective evaluation. And so everything that you tell me could become very important and could play a role in your legal proceeding. That's all part of the informed consent process. You don't offer conclusions about people you haven't even tried to evaluate. And your client is the truth, not the person you're evaluating. AMFT Code of Ethics says avoid therapy with forensic examinees and unless mandated by the legal systems. But then in the next section it says for child custody evals, don't do both. You can treat or you can evaluate. You cannot do both. So they're kind of ironclad when it comes to child custody evals. The NASW Code of Ethics doesn't say much anything that could be applicable to forensic evals. I don't know why. I was really hoping that they would change it with their 2017 code, but they didn't. They don't have a forensic section. And interestingly, not even the National Organization of Forensic Social Work, they don't even have a section of their code that's applicable to forensic evaluation. That might make more sense in a few slides because it's very perplexing at first, but it's a very generic code that could have just as easily been written for a social worker doing therapy as for one doing it's really not applicable at all to forensic evaluation in my opinion. But you can read it for yourself and see that. Now, a great resource is the Specialty Guidelines for Forensic Psychology, offered by the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. Very important that you know this resource well in the forensic arena. I don't care if you're a psychologist or not. It's just a good resource, and it's reputable, and it's well recognized in the field. So I really think, and it's free. You don't have to be a psychologist to access it or anything. So by all means, please get that resource and use it as a good source of information. Talk real quickly about Fry and Dusky, or Fry and Daubert, I mean, Dusky. These are two standards that are used in different districts in the United States on what constitutes good expert testimony. The Fry standard is the older of the two. It was a case where there was an early version of the lie detector introduced as evidence, and the court said, you know, If the topic is outside the range of common experience or knowledge, then we need an expert. And that expert, when they make a deduction, it has to be made from information or evidence or data that has been generally accepted in that field of expertise. But the Daubert standard takes it to a somewhat higher level, I think, and gets more specific. The Daubert standard, number one, clarifies that the judge is ultimately the person who decides whether you're an appropriate expert or not. That's the person who has to be convinced. And they're supposed to base that conclusion on, number one, was this testimony sufficiently based on reliable facts or data? Number two, is it the product of reliable principles and methods? And three, has this witness applied those principles and methods reliably to this specific case? And that's the standard in federal court and increasingly in most state jurisdictions. Here in Florida, we went from Frye to Daubert not very long ago. Now I think there might be some questions in the chat box, so let me take a look at those real quickly here. See what we got. Let's see. Okay, that's just if the judge tells you to do it, you really don't want to say no. Well, I agree, but I've done it. I have said no, and it's always gone well for me. So I'll give you an example. I did a substance abuse evaluation that was connected to a child abuse case, child abuse and neglect case. DCF had an evaluator do an evaluation with the client, but it was internal. It was a contract with DCF, and or with a community organization they contract with, and the client was really contesting the conclusions of that evaluation. And the judge didn't like the quality of the evaluation, didn't think it really withstood scrutiny very well. So the judge ordered an evaluation with an outside expert, and I did the evaluation. And the judge was very happy with my evaluation. He said, "This is the best evaluation I've seen. This is the kind of evaluation we need in our courtroom. I'm so impressed that I'm going to order you to do treatment with this particular mental health professional. So you must do your treatment with Mr. Aaron Norton." And that was actually a court order. I didn't say, "Oh, well, a judge ordered it. I guess I just have to do it." No, I contacted DCF and I contacted the judge and I said, "I'm glad that the evaluation was up to standard. Unfortunately, I can't provide the treatment because of my code of ethics, which states that I should avoid ever providing treatment for a client who I've done a forensic evaluation for. Because what can always happen is somebody can allege that I allowed the possibility that I could benefit financially from this individual's evaluation to cloud my judgment and being objective with my evaluation." And the judge said, "Oh, okay, no problem. I'll have him go see somebody else." Now, if the judge insisted, "No, I'm ordering this, period," I would take it one notch further and say, "For the record, you're ordering me to violate the Code of Ethics of the American Counseling Association, American Mental Health Counselors Association, and American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and to work with an individual who I do not think that I could be fully unbiased with." I've never had to do that. If that didn't work, then I'd probably cave if it were me, but I've never had it happen. So I agree that you don't like, it's not fun to tell a judge no, but remember, judges and attorneys, they're not the ones who are going to defend your license in front of a licensure board. And they're not supposed to know your ethics. And they're not supposed to know good practice in the forensic evaluation arena. You're supposed to know that. And then you're supposed to educate them. And most of them, in my experience, respond well to perfectly appropriate education with perfectly appropriate references. And so I've never had to disobey a judge's order. I just tell the judge, no, and here's why, in a very polite and diplomatic way. And the judge says, okay, and then we move along. So That's kind of my initial thought, but um, I've heard rumor that there are scenarios where the judge really just insists, and I wouldn't want to violate a court order. So if I didn't feel like I could get out of it, I don't really want to sit in jail to prove my point. Personally, that's just my personal opinion. But I would do what's reasonable to avoid it. All right, so let's talk about how you can start to build your forensic expertise. I wish somebody would have told me this stuff years before I took the training with Mbfe, but they didn't. So I had to go back and do some of the stuff later, and it was a pain. My CV has every presentation I've ever given. It's got all my credentials. I've got a transcript of every forensic case I've ever worked on and what those case numbers are. I have documented every training I've ever gone to as an attendee, and I've been published in our field. All of those things help to beef you up as an expert witness. And I might talk about that more in a little bit, but that's the short version. And I might show you an example of a good CV, because there are a lot of them that you can access online of real forensic evaluators. And you can see what they do to show in their CV that they truly are an expert. Because saying I'm a licensed mental health professional isn't enough. Because lots of licensed mental health professionals are not experts in that type of evaluation that you're doing, let alone forensic evals, let alone specific issues connected to that specific case involved in that forensic eval. So let's talk about forensic certification. Now, I mentioned I do substance abuse evals. So I have lots of addiction certifications. I'm a master addiction counselor. I'm a certified master's level addictions professional in Florida, and an internationally certified alcohol and drug counselor, and clinical mental health specialist in substance use and co-occurring disorders by the American Mental Health Counselors Association. So I have those credentials that show in this particular area I've really been vetted. But there are also the question of, how do you show that you know the forensic arena well? Now, I'm not aware of any state that says you can't do forensic evals if you don't have a particular credential as a certified such and such for forensic work. I've never seen it. But what you do have to be able to do is show that you are an expert, and certification is one way you might do that. It's not enough by itself. It's all the other stuff too. But I think it's an important one, and one that is good for people to pursue. Because it's a lot harder for opposing counsel to say you're not an expert when you can say, I'm a certified forensic mental health evaluator recognized by the National Board of Forensic Evaluators, endorsed by the American Mental Health Counselors Association, which means that I have X numbers of hours in forensic related training, and that I have been vetted, and I have received recommendations from colleagues in the forensic arena, and I have passed a written examination successfully with a number of forensic mental health related domains, and I have prepared a sample forensic evaluation report, which was reviewed by a panel of forensic experts, peers in my field of specialty. And I've successfully defended that evaluation in front of a panel of experts for an oral examination. And that's a lot more impressive than I have a graduate degree and a license, for example. So I'll tell you about a few options and non-options too. We'll start with in the literature in the forensic arena, you'll see a lot of references to avoiding those UPC symbol certifications, the ones where you pay them money and you get certified, but there's really not a process that really shows that you know your stuff. Those can actually hurt you more than help you. It'd be better to not be certified than to get a bad certification, because if the opposing counsel researches your credential and finds out, oh, all this guy had to do was send an application with a bunch of money, and then he got certified, but there was no other requirement, then this means nothing. Is this guy really honest? That seems dishonest. That he just props himself up as being a certified such and such, but doesn't tell people, and by the way, all I had to do to get the credential was pay money. So that can actually be a flaw when you're an expert. So first option we'll talk about is the American Board of Forensic Psychology in partnership with the American Board of Professional Psychology, ABPP. Great option if you are a psychologist. So if you're a psychologist, this might be a wonderful option to pursue. If you're not, it's not going to be an option for you. But I think they're a great organization. I think it'd be great to pursue certification with them if you're a psychologist and you would like to do that. Second option, the National Organization of Forensic Social Work. We talked about them earlier when we talked about codes of ethics. But the thing is, when you look at their website, what you see is you can't really use this as a credential. They specifically say it would not be appropriate to list as a credential after one's name. For example, Sally Sue, FSWC. Yeah, it's a certificate program, but it's more like a certificate of attendance. It's not a credential like I'm a certified such and such. But it might be good training. It might be worth taking, and it might beef up your CV. But it is for social workers only. And it really isn't about forensic evaluation. If you kind of read the verbiage, it's more about advocating for people in the criminal justice system. And that's really not going to help you in the role of being a forensic evaluator versus maybe somebody who's treating people in the criminal justice system, in my opinion anyway. That brings us to the third option, the American College of Forensic Examiners. But they're not really an option anymore because their website got taken down. And there's a sad story behind this one, actually, because their founder was involved in a murder-suicide. He allegedly murdered his wife and then killed himself. And then their organization shut down after that. Next option is Forensic Training Institute. The problem is, this is one of those pay us money and you get certified, and that's the only requirement because they had this grandfathering period. But there's a second problem with them, besides it being too easy to get, it's that they appear to no longer be in business as well. Because that website that you saw on the previous slide, if you go there now, this is what you see, that it expired. I mean, I don't know, maybe they're not out of business, but I can't find them anymore with a Google search. So if anybody knows whether they are still in business and if what their requirements are now to get certified, I'd love to hear about it. This brings us to a fifth option, the National Association of Forensic Counselors. And I've never heard anything bad about them. I mean, I know people I respect who seem to really know their stuff, who have a credential from this organization. They seem like a good organization to me. I can't knock them. So it'd be a good option. But when I read, it seems to have a very broad forensic focus because it includes counseling, like you're helping somebody who's connected to the criminal justice system, but it also says evaluation and examination. So that's a little bit more broadly focused. And then they got this big list of credentials. And I was looking to see, well, do any of these have to do with not treating people in the forensic arena, but evaluating them as an expert witness and doing an independent evaluation? The closest fit I could find was certified forensic interviewer. But even that title is a bit problematic to me because an interview is really only one aspect of forensic evaluation. And maybe there's more to it, I don't know. But I think if I were going to get certified by them, for the purpose of doing forensic evaluation, I'd probably look at that credential option. Maybe somebody has that credential and could tell us more about it in the chat box. I've got information in here. They do not require an oral examination, unlike Mbfe, which we'll talk about later. The International Association of Forensic Nurses would be an option if you're a nurse. But it appears that currently, they grandfathered or they closed out a credential they're maintaining but not accepting new applicants for their advanced forensic nursing certificate. So if you don't already have it, I don't think you can get it. And all you can get now is certification related to sexual assaults. That's a very narrow focus, obviously. Seventh option is the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, which is great if you are a psychiatrist. And then there's the American Mental Health Counselors Association. They have a credential called Certified Mental Health Specialist with a specialty in forensic evaluation. And when you read their description, it looks awfully familiar to those of us at Mbfe because we actually helped them develop this credential. We have a partnership with them, and they wanted to create their own credential internally, and we were glad to support them in that. Even though, some people could view it as maybe a form of competition. I kind of view it differently, though. When I look at it, you do have to be a licensed counselor to be eligible for their credential. So if you're a psychologist, social worker, MFT, then you're not eligible. And you have to be a member of their association, which automatically narrows the focus to 6,000 people unless you become a member, which I would encourage you to do if you're a counselor because it's a great organization. They do require 90 hours of training on forensic evaluation, which is more than we require. And they require a minimum of 3 years post-licensure. We require a minimum of 1 year at Mbfe. And they actually wrote our credential in, providing one area where there could be a bit of an advantage to already being certified with us at Mbfe. They said applicants who have maintained the CFMHE credential from Mbfe for 5 years can waive the professional development hours requirement. 3 years if they've also got the CFBA or CCCE credential by us here at Mbfe. So it's kind of more of a partnership. The way I view it is, my personal opinion anyway, is get certified with Mbfe first, and then maybe if you're a counselor and a member of AMCA, or you want to be a member of AMCA, then move on to this credential if you're interested in it at all. So I will, but they don't have, this is a weakness. They have no written or oral exam. It's really just documentation of training and experience and recognition by your peers, but there's no exam. Now that could change in the future, but that's a flaw. So I wouldn't recommend doing that by itself at this time, because do you really want to be in court and then they say, so tell me about this wonderful credential, and they butter it up, and then they say, and what kind of examination did you have to pass? And then it's revealed that you didn't have to. There was no exam. Ninth option is us, the National Board of Forensic Evaluators. What makes us unique, I think, is that we really fill in a gap because we're the only body I know of that is specifically providing certification in forensic evaluation versus forensic counseling or social work, advocacy, or therapy for people, for forensic populations. That also will certify any type of licensed mental health professional, whether they're a counselor, an MFT, a CSW, a psychologist, psychiatrist, or psychiatric nurse practitioner. We are a potential home for you, a fellowship that all of the licensed mental health professions can have access to. And I think that's very unique. We are also the only one officially endorsed by the American Mental Health Counselors Association. Established in 2003 by Dr. Norman Hoffman, we're a not-for-profit public charity with a mission of quality training, continuing education, and advocacy for mental professionals in the forensic evaluation environment. Approved education provider under MBCC, and we're headquartered on the east coast of Florida in Ormond Beach. And Dr. Hoffman created this organization because, number one, he thought people need quality training if they're going to be doing this. Because he saw lots of cases where people didn't do a good job with forensic evaluation. And that really gives the whole profession a bad rep, I think, when that happens. But second, he wanted there to be an organization that would say you can come from any licensed mental health profession. If your scope of practice says you can diagnose and treat, then you have a home here, or at least you can if you want it. So the credentials are a certified forensic mental health evaluator, the flagship credential. And then there are 2 advanced specialty certifications, including certified child custody evaluator and certified forensic behavioral analyst. This one is really interesting. It's more the role of being a consultant or a trainer Think like consulting or training law enforcement on how to interact with people with mental illness on the streets, or think about consulting with schools on identifying early warning signs a student could be struggling with their mental health. This was created in partnership with Dr. Gregory Mbfe, the former director of the Behavioral Science Unit of the FBI. It's a very interesting training. In fact, in the training workshop, one of the things we did was you had to kind of analyze a case that involved a shooting, whether it was a school shooting or a workplace shooting or that sort of thing from a psychological perspective. The steps to get certified are to apply and pay the certification fee. And then from the point that you apply or attend a workshop, you pass the written exam within 90 days. And then you submit a sample report, which we train you on how to create that sample report. We give you lots of tools, a sample report outline, a checklist, a list of terms and definitions that can be used in the report, and an 8-hour certification workshop that's included in the certification fee that kind of teaches you how to do some of those things. And then you defend that report for your oral examination. And then if you pass the oral exam, you become a certified forensic mental health evaluator. You also need a minimum of 40 hours of forensic training or experience. So if you don't have 40 hours of experience, then you can substitute 40 hours of training in the forensic arena. If you don't have 40 hours of training, but you have lots of experience, you can substitute the 40 hours of experience. You have to be licensed for at least a full year, and that's independently licensed. So that means you can diagnose and treat without being under supervision. You have to have proof of your malpractice insurance, association membership if applicable, and 3 professional references to your ethical, moral, and clinical skills. You have to agree to abide by a code of ethics, disclose a history of professional sanctions, etc. They're all part of the process. Now we can go into resources, but first I want to look at the chat box and see if we have any questions about credentialing. All right, nothing. Okay. So some resources I would recommend to learn more about forensics. This is a book that's expensive, but it's a great reference. And it's kind of wordy and academic, but it's good and thorough. Psychological Evaluations for the Courts. This one's shorter, and it's not as wordy, and it's cheaper, but it's also a great resource by a very well-known forensic expert, Mark Ackerman. And this book is actually from a series, and I love this series because they have your introductory foundations of forensic assessment, but then they have a whole bunch of books that are specialty areas of forensic evaluation. So for example, here's Evaluation of Competence to Stand Trial. So let's say that you are a mental professional who says, I read the basic book about forensics, but I'm interested in specializing in competency evaluations. You might get this book from the series as well. They've got a book for all kinds of forensic evaluations. So you start off more broad, and then you get a more narrow focus of a particular type of forensic evaluation. And then this is a great book on the left-hand side. It's written by some of the same authors as the first book I showed you, but it's much more casually worded, ripe with very cheesy and dry jokes. And it's very practical. It's how do you write a good report and how do you provide good testimony in court? On the right-hand side, a great read for helping you to learn more about how to detect signs of malingering and deception, which is important in forensic evaluation. And I'm going to show you some other resources as well here in just a moment. In fact, I might do that. I'm going to do that right now, actually. I'm going to show you on Mbfe's website some stuff. I'll first show you some good CVs. So Randy Otto is a very well-known forensic expert. Written a lot of the books and articles that you'll read in our profession. I had the pleasure of having him be my professor for my legal and ethical course in my master's program, and we now teach in the same graduate program. And you'll see his degrees and his professional experience. You'll see grants and contracts, all his publications, and they go on and on. Now, this is an intimidating CV. Don't think that your CV has to be like this. This is very intimidating, but at least you can see the kind of stuff he includes. Conference presentations, all the presentations he's given, because those things help to show your expertise. And professional organizations, association membership, and affiliations can look good on your CV. Journals that he's edited or reviewed, I've never done any of that, so that won't be on mine. The coursework that he's taught, because it's great when you can show that you teach coursework, graduate level coursework, in the kinds of areas that you're working in. Service awards and that sort of thing. You can look at my CV if you want at anorton.com. That's anorton.com. And then if you click on About Me, and then the menu, About Me, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see my CV, which I try to update every few months or so, that you can click on, and if that's helpful to you. Let's look at, I mentioned publications, by the way. If you're getting published in a peer-reviewed professional journal is hard. Getting published in a professional magazine in the mental health field, a little bit easier. Maybe NADAC's Addiction Professional Magazine, maybe Counselor Magazine, maybe AMCA's The Advocate Magazine, always looking for great articles. And you can write an article in a particular area of expertise that matches your forensic specialization well. And you usually learn a lot in the process of researching and writing an article anyway. But you don't have to do that stuff to do forensic evals. I'm just saying these are examples of ways that you can beef up your resume. Some other resources, at Mbfe, we've got training events, live, webinars on demand, and certified home studies. So live training events, one thing you will see is here's a training where a judge is presenting. She's an experienced courtroom judge, and she's going to tell you, here's what I'm looking for in a good report, and here's what I think makes a report bad. And if you click on it, it's a 1-hour webinar. It's not that costly. It's $10 if you are a member of an organization that partners with Mbfe or you're connected with our organization. $20 if you're not. Or you can attend for free if certain other criteria are met, if you don't want a CE certificate. But I recommend always getting a CE certificate because, again, that beefs up your resume. Ethics, hearsay, and ex parte. We're about to launch a dangerous witness training. And I don't see it on here, but Valentino, maybe you can chime in. We have a certification workshop coming up, right?
We do, yes. Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and make it visible to the public.
So in a moment, you'll be able to see we have a certification workshop coming up in October in partnership with the West Virginia Licensed Professional Counselors Association. It's a webinar. You could attend that, and when you pay for that webinar, an 8-hour workshop, you're not just paying for the workshop, you're paying for the entire certification process as a forensic mental health evaluator. So that means the 8-hour workshop, that means you're paying for your written exam, review of your oral report, your oral examination, your application fee, and your certification fee, all in one discounted rate of $500. So that would be a great way to pursue certification if you'd like to do that. And then there are also trainings that are webinars on demand. So we got lots of those: parental alienation, bad versus good witness from a judge's perspective, COVID-19 resources, ethics updates in forensic mental health, the clinician's guide to conceptualizing and assessing personality disorders, social investigations, writing a successful report, fun with Z codes, comprehensive mental status exam, business practices, the list goes on and on. So these are all usually pretty affordable trainings as well. They're typically like $15 per contact hour or so. And they're on demand, so you can take them at your own pace and
The training is
get the
now.
CE certificates. Oh, it is up now? All right. So if you go to live training events, you will see the upcoming certification workshop. We have lots of partnerships with state chapters of associations in Florida, Georgia, West Virginia, Utah, Washington. Um, but you don't have to be in one of those states to do this. But this will help you get started with that certification process, just like I did several years ago. Let's see what else. Oh, if you are connected to our organization, which means either you're certified by us or you're an applicant who has applied for our certificate, or you are a candidate who's already passed your written exam, then you have access to some special members only resources. And one of those is the member forum right here. And that gives you an opportunity to ask questions to forensic evaluators all over the country who can chime in as experts and give you free answers to your questions in the forensic arena.
We do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the chat box.
Okay, I'll get a question in just a second. So that is worth its weight in gold. I've used it so many times myself when I'm like, man, I don't know the answer to that, or I don't know about a resource for this. Then I'll post it in the forum, and some forensic expert somewhere in the country is going to know and point me in the right direction, or maybe several will. So it's just a great free resource that you kind of get as part of being involved. Now I'm going to go to questions, see what kinds of questions you guys might have. And then we have one last polling question as well that we'll get to before we wrap up at 5 o'clock here, Eastern time. Questions are, how often are Mbfe certification workshops offered each year? I would say usually every 3 months or so, sometimes every 2 months. The next one's in October, which is only a month away. We're going to be doing one in February, I know. We're going to be doing one probably in May. We're probably going to do another one in July with Amka. So it kind of gives you an idea. I would say there's probably a good 5 or 6 workshops a year, and the next one being in October. Now, there is a way to do an on-demand version of our workshop, but it is a recording that's, I want to say, about 5 years old. So we've updated the slides a little bit since then. I recommend doing the live workshop. Way better to do it that way so you can interact and ask questions and really make sure that you're getting things answered. But you could sign up, apply to be a CFMHE and do an on-demand version of the workshop instead if you wanted to. It's just not what I recommend. Next question, can guardian ad litem work count as experience since forensic reports are prepared for the courts? I would say it depends on what the guardian ad litem does in your jurisdiction. So if the guardian ad litem is providing, is collecting data and then creating a report that answers one or more psycholegal questions that's being offered to the court, then those hours should be able to count. But in my jurisdiction, a guardian ad litem doesn't do that stuff. All they do is advocate for the child. They don't do evaluations. So it really depends on your jurisdiction and your state and what a guardian ad litem does there. Is an undergrad thesis regarding the inner mind of a serial killer considered forensic experience? So yes, we specifically say on our website that you can include research projects if they're clearly forensic mental health related. You'll see experience defined here, and we do talk about research, and training areas are defined here on the website. And I got to that by clicking on certifications and then CFMHE. And that's where you will find all of that lovely fine print. Next question was, I would highly recommend the course. I've completed my report and will be having my oral review in December. Great training, great support, and Valentino is great to work with. All right, thank you, Pamela. So kudos to you, Valentino, as well. And I think that's all the questions that we have for right now. Now, you do have a few minutes, so you could throw in another question if you want to. But in the meantime, I'd like to launch our final polling question. Final polling question is kind of for me to know and understand. Let's see what we got here. Activate and full screen. My current level of interest in training as a forensic mental health evaluator can best be described as A, extremely interested, B, very interested, C, moderately interested, D, a little interested, and E, not interested at all. You know, sometimes people will hear a chat I give about forensic evals, and they'll say, yeah, good job letting me know, because now I know I don't want to do it. It's really not me. I don't like it. And then other times people hear it and they're like, oh my gosh, where has this been all my career? I would love to do this kind of work. So I'm kind of curious on what your experiences are. And so far, it looks like most of you are extremely interested, and some of you are very interested as well. So I'm glad to hear that. I love it. I love doing forensic evaluation work, and I find it very fulfilling, very interesting, and I would hope that you'd have a similar experience. But if you don't like doing the kind of stuff that we do for forensic evals, then really a good thing to avoid. If you're not a person who likes doing evaluating and testing, or you don't like reviewing records and piecing together that complex picture, and you never ever want to find yourself in court, ever testifying as an expert, then you probably don't want to do this kind of work. Probably wouldn't be a good idea. But those of us who do it, we love it. Seems like. Let's see what else we got in the chat box here. A thank you note. So I believe that probably should cover it. Now, let's say you have a question that you didn't get answered today. I'm going to go back for a moment to the very beginning of this slideshow and show you my email address. It is aaron@mbfe.net. We have already pasted, again, the link for handouts, and we've pasted the link for the evaluation survey. Might want to paste that one more time if you don't mind, Valentino.
Everyone got it.
You guys already got it?
Yeah.
Great. Also, Valentino just posted my email address, aaron@mbfe.net. So let's say you got a question that we didn't get to answer today. I know we moved at a fast pace. It was pretty action-packed. Then just shoot me an email, and I'll see what I can do to answer your question. I really want to make sure that you have the information you're really hoping to get from today's webinar. And with that, I think we will close things out. Wish you all a happy and fulfilling weekend. I just want to say I'm very impressed with how you all, as my colleagues, have been doing during a pandemic. You know, it's a difficult time for everybody and for clinicians. I've got clients coming out of the woodworks right now because it's a difficult time for people. So hang in there, because we're going to all get through this together. And hopefully I'll see some of you either in the associations or maybe in the NBFE fellowship. We'll see you next time.